The disruption caused by the Second World War and the aftermath of war led to tremendous change in the United States that would unfold in the following decades. A cultural shift was underway. First, during the war, with the workforce in the United States drained of millions of men engaged in military service abroad, mobilized for the war effort, this created the space for social and economic change as women increasingly entered the workforce, as did people with disabilities, for whom the general labor shortage expanded their opportunities in public and private agencies alike. Employment placement programs were created to find work for people with disabilities because of the desperate needs created by the war and the labor demands. Now, this proved temporary, as returning veterans would displace disabled workers, but it did provide a case study on what was obviously possible and an increasing level of advocacy for access and opportunity began. Another major development linked to the war was the exposure of horrible abuses that took place in the long-established institutions, and this began a long process of dismantling them. Now, during the war, millions of servicemen and women went abroad, and the U.S. government allowed conscientious objectors to fulfill their national duty through public service. And about 12,000 Americans served in this capacity, and 3,000 of them performed their public service in asylums, mental hospitals, and disability vocational centers for people with cognitive and developmental disabilities. Now, this meant that 3,000 Americans who would have never set foot in such an institution and had no connection to the topic were suddenly thrust into a reality that utterly shocked them. They saw the brutal treatment that these institutions inflicted on those in their care. Their horror motivated change. So following the war, they formed the National Mental Health Foundation, and in 1947, through the foundation, Frank Wright published his Out of Sight, Out of Mind. The book's subtitle made its purpose clear: a graphic picture of present-day institutions' care of the mentally ill in America based on more than 2,000 eyewitness reports. Now, this book received praise by the former First Lady, Eleanor Roosevelt, a great champion of human rights, and she promoted its call for reform. But the process of reform was slow, for public attention was raised, and as quickly as it was, the public eye shifted to some other concern. We will return to this long process of deinstitutionalization a bit later in our course. Now, another dimension of change was led by parents who advocated for their children with developmental disabilities. Now, recall how American culture had encouraged parents to give up their children to be institutionalized under the care of medical experts. But in 1946, a mother in New Jersey placed an ad in her local newspaper looking for other parents with children who had developmental disabilities. And she called for the creation of a grassroots organization. And she, along with other parents, formed the New Jersey Group for Retarded Children. Now, this was the term then used as the accepted norm. They resisted the call by the medical establishment, by doctors, psychologists, by educators, to institutionalize their children, to hide them. But they wanted society to accept them. And one of the leading psychologists of the time, Erik Erikson, sent his own newborn child, after his wife had given birth, to an institution, telling his other children that the child had died at birth. An example of the prevailing wisdom at the time that these parents were fighting against. And thus, the parents had to confront society, social pressure, medical expertise, institutional power, and cultural bias, organizing on behalf of their children to battle stigma and challenge this cultural bias. And so, a movement began. In 1950, Pulitzer Prize and Nobel Prize winning American author Pearl S. Buck published The Child Who Never Grew, sharing openly about her experience with her own daughter with developmental disabilities. In 1953, popular TV and movie star Dale Evans wrote Angel Unaware about her child who had died at 2. Presenting her not as evidence of some divine judgment, an assessment with a long religious history, but as a blessing. In their own way, each was challenging this prevailing bias, and they were part of a movement of parental advocacy. In 1952, the National Association for Retarded Children was created, and it gained 100,000 members over the next decade. So this movement was making a difference in the lives of those affected and raising awareness in the nation. In 1961, President John F. Kennedy created a special panel of experts on intellectual disabilities to examine the topic and provide guidance on how best to move forward productively. He, we should note, was influenced by the experience of having a sister, Rosemary, with a disability. In 1973, the organization changed its name to the National Association for Retarded Citizens to represent people of all ages and to prevent the infantilizing of adults with developmental or cognitive disabilities. Since 1992, the organization has been known simply as the ARC, and there's one here in San Diego which continues the work of inclusion and advocacy. The final example of the impact of World War II that I'd like to present stems from the experience of veterans returning home. Now, as we've seen, veterans were an important contingent of the disability community who were in a position to organize and advocate because of the acknowledged obligations of state and society to support their rehabilitation and vocational needs. And in 1943, Congress expanded vocational training and educational opportunities and rehabilitation services for people with disabilities through the La Follette Act. Now, increasingly, the language of advocacy became a matter of rights as citizens, particularly as citizens who had sacrificed so much. They fought tyranny abroad, but what did they encounter back here in the U.S.? So here was the seed that would launch not only the civil rights movement, but also the disability rights movement. In the 1940s, for example, in Cleveland, veteran Henry Williams and fellow African Americans organized protests in their wheelchairs over the lack of equal services in rehabilitation centers and housing for veterans with disabilities. Williams stated, and I quote, "I was fighting to stamp out those same principles that we fought against during the war. Basically, sir, I was fighting for the civil rights of every disabled citizen." This advocacy was the precursor to the organizing and change-making that you've learned about in the Judy Heumann autobiography and in Crip Camp.